So talk to me about stats. It's always going to be a bit of a closed wall. LinkedIn, I wish you could just pay them $5 and they'd let you have some sort of API access to stats and see some magic.
Mm-hmm.
Where do you see it going? Where do you see the stats ultimately going in general, not just video, but podcasting overall?
Yeah. So as someone who has come from a content side of things, from a measurable side of things, from a social side of things, where we did campaigns for corporations and had to report back to them on exactly what we did, who's worked in ads on sites, and this is your spend, and this is, how many clicks you got, here's your cost, here's how it broke down. Podcasting stats are kind of the Wild West of measurement right now, and it's not going to stay like that. So we're moving towards a crackdown. We're seeing people who are writing news articles. It's coming up in mainstream news where people are saying things like, oh, this network or this show had inflated statistics because they were putting an ad into a mobile game, and every single click that the user did to get extra coins for their character counted as a download. Well, that's not a real listen, and we all know that. And with advertisers now just still throwing more money at radio. So with podcast advertising, it's like 13-ish per person. And with radio, it's over 50. And that's going to shift at some point in time. But right now, they can measure radio and they can measure it very well. And
really?
You can't.
Because it seems like it's just out there in the ether. It's not like you have an actual download stat.
To a certain degree, but they know how many listeners. I mean, think of Nielsen and TV. They have a similar system for radio where they can kind of be like, okay, we had this many listeners in this region. You may not know exactly how many it's hitting. So think of it in impressions instead of actual, unique users. But
and you can measure the impact on the buying side, right? Yeah,
exactly. And with podcasting, it's not like that yet. So you end up with people who are spending money on podcast advertising, and we're seeing reports saying that podcast listeners are more likely to buy, and that in these certain categories, they're buying more and more. But with that push for people to spend more money on podcast advertising, and with the listenership rising, they're going to want to see more measurement. And there is going to be a movement. So Google Podcasts, they're putting up more pages. We know that analytics for Google are rolling over. They're sunsetting the old ones. They've changed scroll. They've changed how near me search features work. When you search some things now, podcasts pop up, just like YouTube used to pop up on the first page. And as that becomes more standardized, I feel like they're going to lead the way in instituting some kind of measurement. It is just wild to me that there isn't a standardized way to give information, and you have to rely on each user to give their own.
There's a lot of things I got from that. One is I should probably advertise on some apps for this podcast.
Before it goes away, right?
Right, before someone figures out the loophole.
I think it's 12 seconds you got to get someone to listen to that ad.
Ooh, that's a long time.
But they want the coins for their character.
They want the coins. That's true. Maybe the upgrade for their avatar. Maybe they'll finally get legs. So it's interesting. I think I can also see the stats improving, because where the stats go, the money and the sponsorship goes. So the better statistics we have, the better tracking of all the impressions, not just the downloads, all the impressions, how long they're listening, were they listening to particular parts of the podcast? When we start getting that, I think that's where you're able to justify more and more on the sponsorship side. Joe Rogan kind of sponsorships are like the simple, okay, lots of downloads, don't really care too much if people are listening the whole way through or not. But that's just, it's so many millions that it's like, okay, here's some millions and it's notoriety. But for all the micro, the niches, the perfectly targeted podcasts, it'd be great to have more stats so you can show that maybe you own like a sub segment, like a micro segment.
Exactly. And right now the numbers are so, they can be read in different ways. And it brings me back to like a content influencer where they're going to report to a client that they're working with and they're going to say, oh, well, we took your money you gave us and we ran this campaign and, oh, we got this many impressions overall. And it's a giant number. Well, it's a giant number because they added up how many it could potentially reach every single time. So they've twisted the statistics to report what looks good. Is it potential? Yes. But we're in that space where because there's no standardized measure but IAB is starting to do more specialized reporting. But because there's no standardized measure, people can say things like, if you look at the top networks for podcasts and the ones, they have these astronomical numbers of downloads and you're like, wow, that's a network. Look at how many downloads they have. But then you look, that network has 68 shows. When you break that down per show, it's not that many. It's a normal podcast, but because they have so many under one umbrella, they're reporting the entire network's numbers and making it look like a powerhouse. But we have no breakdown of how many listeners are under each show umbrella. So in theory, they could just add 12 more shows every time they needed more and hope one of them hit.
I don't know what to think about that. I mean, I guess it's kind of half of it's brilliant and half of it is challenging, right? But you get one show that really nails it, and now you could almost claim that all the other ones are nailing it too as a part of this network.
Exactly. And from an advertiser standpoint, that's a little bit of a nightmare, right? You want to spend money, you want to show how it was spent. Well, what if you spend money on the network and they put you on the show that doesn't get anything? Right. And, the same thing with buying ads just in general for podcasting. There's all these reports that kind of show that those ads get results, that podcast audiences are buying audiences and they're willing to purchase things. But the cost and the financial stuff sunk into it is high, and to the point where, another random statistics prediction for 2023, it's going to get to the point where when advertisers look at the budget that they're putting into podcast advertising, they may just end up sponsoring an entire show instead.
Tell me about that.
Well, I was talking to one of my friends who works in advertising, and I was discussing with him the cost of, producing a show and how much does it cost to have a show in production. And when I said that to him, he said, wow, I got turned down when I tried to buy advertising on, I think it was iHeart Media or on a podcast. And he said they wanted this much and it was astronomical. I could buy an entire podcast for that. So there's this space for these sponsored podcasts where an up and coming podcaster could work with a sponsor. P.S. We do this at Ringmaster. If you need this, we can vet and find you the right person to be on your sponsored podcast and be the creator on it. And they could go ahead and just skin an entire podcast with their brand, and it's sponsored by them. It reaches an audience that they like, maybe Pampers sponsors a podcast and they have two moms talking about the newborn days. And they've paid for the podcast. They get advertising on every single one. The moms get an outlet for their thoughts and it connects to something else they're doing. They're content creators. And the whole thing kind of becomes symbiotic, and they cut out that middleman of doing advertising and not knowing what they're getting, at least until the statistics catch up.
Yeah, I've wondered about networks that, I love to see networks grow in this next year. I don't know if it's going to be 23 or if it's 24, 25, but the idea of the network effect, I'm seeing HubSpot has a network. You mentioned another, I don't say more nefarious network that was combining stats, but we're starting to see more networks. Still, where do you see those going? Are we going to see the age of the podcast network this year, or is that a little bit out?
I think it's a mixed bag, right?
Okay.
So I think that we will see more podcast networks with the companies that are doubling down and putting in more podcasts, and with how many companies are owned by other companies and all that, we will see more networks. But I'm hoping that with the rise of a push for accurate statistics and analytics and some kind of standardization that we'll start seeing people who are above board break out which shows are leading their networks. So we have this many downloads. Here are our top 3 shows and their download numbers. They're not going to spell out how much every single one gets, but if they're upfront and you can see that 75% of their downloads come from their top 3 shows, that's different than thinking that they all have a certain number across the board. And honestly, it allows them to charge more for those shows. So they should be doing that.
Right. Huh. Yeah, there is something to that. I wonder about how tightly combined they should be. Can you have a network of shows that are just all across the board? I guess you could have anything you want, but I'm thinking about the more generic network. Maybe it's based on an overall, brand or conglomerate versus a tightly focused, like a B2B marketing podcast network or something where it's very tightly targeted.
So from a content SEO perspective,
Yeah.
I like to see things that have to do with each other. So that would make more sense to me. And also with things coming like Apple Podcasts, we saw that they were adding I'm not going to come up with the right word, the title tags or the things that were tracking what the topical items were in each podcast. With things like that being added behind the scenes, I think that staying topical and staying on a certain area will help your podcast not only perform, but then also combine with your content, which a lot of people are doing now, and have them partner up and kind of push things to the top. If you've got 28 shows and they're completely different and the only thing in common is the same person is writing the check for all of them, that's not as relevant. And how do you pick a category for that? How do you categorize that network? How do you say what you specialize in? How do you really niche down and get advertisers to pay for the special group of people that they're going to reach through you?
Yeah. Interesting. Networks, something to keep our eyes on. And next time doesn't have to be next week. Life's too short, and we have way too much to talk about. Find show notes full of takeaways, lessons, and links at creatingthegreatestshow.com. For more information on launching your own podcast or working with us to produce your existing show, come on down to the big tent at ringmaster.com. Until then, friends, whatever you do, do it with all your might. Work at it, if necessary, early and late, in season and out of season, not leaving a stone unturned and never deferring for a single hour that which can be done just as well now. P.T. Barnum.